30 minutes of the television show, kind of a sneak preview, and I think you'll enjoy that. Closer. Why did we write this book, you might ask? The answer is because it was there. The pictures were there, the ideas were there, the inspiration was there, and the time was right. There hadn't been a major picture and word biography of Lincoln for the last 40 years, and the time was right for a television documentary as well. No one had ever done a definitive film biography of Lincoln using the words and pictures of the time. This book could have been done by my grandfather, Frederick Hill Meserve, who spent his life collecting the photographs that fill our pages. But the idea never crossed his mind. He never saw himself as a biographer of Lincoln. Rather, he was the dean of collectors, the first great historian of American photographs. His mission, as he saw it, was to assist other biographers of the Civil War and the Lincoln story to make their material more vivid and accurate. To most, Meserve was a mild-mannered New York textile executive. To those close to him, he was a relentless sleuth. Born in 1865, the very year Lincoln was assassinated, Meserve grew up at a time when Americans didn't want to be reminded of the Civil War. Tens of thousands of glass negatives upon which the images of conflict had been recorded were discarded or used for greenhouses. Even some of the original photographs of Lincoln were lost or destroyed. Meserve's father had fought in the Great War, had worked his way up from private to major, had been wounded at Antietam, had distinguished himself in the wilderness and at Cold Harbor. 25 years later, in 1890, living in New York as a young man, my grandfather set out to illustrate his father's war memoirs. It was the beginning of a lifelong adventure. The young Meserve haunted secondhand shops and auction galleries, searching for the photographic evidence of America's past. He rifled family albums, purchased the archives of Civil War magazines and newspapers, copied the pertinent contents of historical and military institutions, traded with other collectors, and contacted innumerable survivors of the war, asking for their pictures and for identification of their comrades. Meserve's most important find came in 1902, when he traced thousands of Matthew Brady glass negatives to their storage place in Jersey City and acquired them. Trembling, he held up to the light a long-lost negative of Lincoln, then another and another, 7 in all. The searching out of pictures and their classification and verification became what my grandfather called his secret life. Although he didn't drink, a long evening with his negatives left him, he said, in a state of total intoxication. Our book could have also been done by my mother, Meserve's daughter, Dorothy Kuhnhart. She had the cool mind of an historian, as well as the hot instincts of a journalist tracking a story. She also had an extraordinary eye for pictures, a nose for human detail, and an uncommon ear for words. But she never considered taking on the entire Lincoln story either. Maybe she was inhibited by our good friend Carl Sandburg and his mighty pile of 2 million words on the subject, embellished with enough bombastic self-promotion to scare any competitor away. She chose smaller aspects of the Lincoln story in which to specialize. Mary Lincoln was one of them, Little Tad, the assassination and the days surrounding it. In addition to her writing, she dreamed of translating the Lincoln story onto film, but the time was not yet right. When my grandfather died, my mother became the custodian of his huge, rambling collection. I say rambling because alongside the Civil War and Lincoln, it included collections inside of the collection. The American stage, Indians, Barnum, early Hollywood, Quakers, clerics, European royalty, autographs of the famous. My mother built up a superb Lincoln library and acquired a cache of Lincoln-related relics and mementos. Mary Lincoln's traveling commode, the horsehair for the couch on which Lincoln had courted Mary, the whale oil lamps that lit the parlor in which the two were married. I remember growing up with piles of Lincoln books everywhere, winding up the staircase, shutting out the light from windows, covering my mother's bed 10 deep so she could hardly steal a corner for sleep. After she inherited the Meserve collection from her father, we paid frequent visits to the bank vault where the delicate Brady negatives were stored. It was almost a religious experience, the way those glass negatives, which are now in the National Portrait Gallery, were held and worshipped. Philip and Peter remember those trips too. Remember their great-grandfather and their grandmother, and much of the Lincoln mystique they initiated has been passed down and is now beginning to course through the veins of still another generation, my grandchildren. So you can see our book is the product of a lot of family, and you can guess how well equipped we were when we finally decided, after years of talking about it, to set out on our dual mission 2 years ago, the book and the documentary. Our book is not a book about the photographs of Abraham Lincoln. We do not write about how the pictures were taken or try to appreciate them artistically. In many cases, we disregard their compositions, normally so reverently adhered to. In fact, the purity of the Lincoln photographs has never been violated in such an extravagant manner. Pieces of them blown up so large, negatives cropped so hard, emotion literally squeezed out of them. What we are after is the real Lincoln, to bring him to life, not the stiff, historical Lincoln so cloaked in greatness that he never really looks into our eyes or warmly shakes our hand. We are after the lean and flesh Lincoln, who wrapped for sleep in his long yellow nightshirt looked very much like an ostrich, one observer thought, or when dressed, a skeleton occupying a suit, another suggested. A very tall man with a beak of a nose and leathery face, with flat feet, size 14, aching corns and pigeon toes, with wiry hair that resisted combs, remarkably white and even teeth, a high voice that couldn't keep tune when it tried to sing. A man who ate little, lunched on a single pear or apple, drank only Adam's ale, that's what he called water, who took blue mass pills for chronic constipation, who let anyone into the White House who wanted to see him, who sat up late into the night trying to think up ways he could pardon convicted soldiers, who could quote Shakespeare by the hour and knew more about military tactics than his generals. Out of this brooding, introverted, self-educated man came great bellows of laughter, usually brought on by his own often rank and racy stories. For moments anyway, he could forget how deadly serious the world was. When he told his stories, his face lit up and he would lift his knees to his chest and wrap his great arms around them as he rocked back and forth in his chair, wheezing and gasping with mirth. Sometimes, especially in storms, he would wander around the city of Washington alone at night, unrecognized. He was absent-minded, stubborn, slow to act, kept his own counsel. Somehow he grew out of the prejudices he had learned as a backwoodsman. He wrote like a poet, he cried easily, tears rolling down his cheeks without embarrassment. He never knew he was anything special. He should have guided his wife better in their Washington years. He overindulged his children. He loved models, devices, engines, tools, big machinery. He lost 20 pounds in his 1,504 days in office and aged 20 years. At the end, although only 56, he was tired and sick, and the laugh had gone out of him. If Philip and Peter and I have captured some of this realness in our book and in our movie, some of this flesh and blood, then we have accomplished at least a part of what we set out to do. Now here's my son Peter to talk about the television show.
As the three of us begin doing more and more of these talks together, we learn from one another and we share things with one another. Tonight we didn't share our speeches with one another, and if you saw me kind of crossing things out and giggling, it's because my short speech is now a little shorter. I'm really the nuts and bolts member of this team. I'm the director of the television show, and I thought I would just tell you a few things about how it came to happen that three members of one family would work on the same project. I first want to tell you what a pleasure it is to be here. We're also local Westchester people. We're from Chappaqua. Philip and I were born and raised in Chappaqua. My father still lives there. And the show and the book were both produced out of Mount Kisco, New York. As a matter of fact, we were over here in Mamaroneck, one block from here at the Acme Sound Studios, where we did a lot of our recording for the show and where we built the soundtrack record that you might have heard as you took your seats. So we were here quite a bit. I'd also like to acknowledge one of your neighbors, Fred Cohen, who's here tonight. Fred's the man who's taking our 4-hour television show and distributing it worldwide. You know, when Governor Cuomo published his recent book on Lincoln and democracy for the people of Poland, it became a bestseller. There's now an edition in Japan. There's plans for one in Russia, Italy, and Spain. And in fact, when portions of the Meserve collections were sold at our grandmother's death, foreign buyers were amongst the biggest of the bunch. So there's clearly a real thirst for Lincoln abroad. We were laughing backstage before we came forward, telling a story how when the soundtrack was released 2 weeks ago, part of our team was in a record store, and the person in front of him was buying the Lincoln CD, and the checkout teller was from India, and the man was trying to explain why this was such an important man on the cover of the CD, and he couldn't find the right word, so he finally said, "He's like your Gandhi, only better." I worked at ABC News for 10 years, and towards the end of that time, I worked on the first collaboration with my father. He had just retired as the managing editor of Life magazine and was writing a book on the 50th anniversary of Life magazine. And I produced a 2-hour special with Barbara Walters for ABC on the anniversary as well. And it was the first time we were able to pull together the two mediums of a book and a television show. Probably most important of all, we enjoyed working together and wanted to do more of it. Soon after that, I left ABC and formed my own small documentary production company. And our first independent production was called JFK in His Own Words. And again, a collaboration happened with my father. He was writing a book with Life magazine called Life in Camelot, and we produced the hour-long documentary for HBO. The style developed in that show was a style of telling a story primarily in the words of the subject himself, and it became sort of a trademark for us during the next 5 years and the basis for Lincoln. Those shows were called In Their Own Words, and really is the formula we used as we produced this show. From the very start, my brother Philip split his time working at his Ossining church and writing for Kuhnhart Productions. Most recently, he wrote with my father the PBS documentary on the New York Public Library called The People's Palace. And by the end of 1990, he left his full-time parish work to produce and write Lincoln. And at that point, the foundations for a family television production company were put into place. And the book and the television show began both at once. But as my father said, our family connection with Lincoln goes back much further. It goes back to my grandmother, Dorothy Meserve Kuhnhart, and to her father, Frederick Hill Meserve, who did collect the Meserve collection and who really allowed this all to happen. And in our pulling together material for the show, my father found an old recording from the early Today Show on radio, where we found my great-grandfather, we called him Gampy, a brief recording of his voice talking about the collection. And we brought the tape tonight. I'm just going to ask if we can, it's only about a minute, if we can play that, you can hear what he was like. This was, he was 93 or 4 at the time. And
Fortunately, the art of photography has been perfected by Lincoln's time. But if it weren't for our guest tonight, many of the Lincoln photographs would have been lost. I want you to meet Mr. Frederick Hill Meserve, the historian and doctor of letters, the foremost collector of Lincoln photographs in the world. Mr. Meserve was born the year that Lincoln died, and he spent an entire lifetime, I want you to know, seeking out, verifying, and cataloging the known photographs of Abraham Lincoln. Actually, when did you start?
My father was an officer in Grant's army in the wilderness, and he wrote for me the manuscript of his 4-year service in the army. And in order to illustrate his sheets of writing, I searched for pictures, photographs mainly. And that beginning of historical search was my beginning in the search for pictures, photographs of the Civil War.
How many pictures do you think are in your collection, actually, Mr. Meserve?
The Civil War pictures number 100,000, but the pictures of Lincoln only 133.
Philip and I both knew Frederick Hill Meserve. I was 11 and he was 12 when he died in the 60s, 1964. We both have worked with the Meserve collection since we were boys. We were the people who were asked to carry it and box it and unpack it and recatalog it and move it from location to location, and as it was being worked on for various projects over the past 40 years of our lives. So we were very familiar with it from that standpoint. One of the things we found most helpful and endearing during the project was that my grandmother, who, in addition to this large collection of photographs, collected an enormous primary source library, had the habit during her lifetime of putting little pieces of white paper in the books, and she wrote her research notes on those sheets of white paper. So as we went through those books, we had the benefit of her help and assistance and insight again and again, and we almost came to feel that she was working with us on this project. We spent months organizing it, identifying it, unboxing it again for this final time of this final project, and cataloging it for both the book's use and for the television's use. We decided for the television show, we decided not to use any artwork. In that respect, it's very unlike the Civil War show that aired on PBS a while ago. We decided strictly to use photographs, unless it was an illustration from a newspaper that was making a point of the day. But as we looked at the dailies as they came up on the screen, the three of us would watch what we were building, and again and again, each time it lapsed into artwork, we kind of felt it didn't work, that we were being lectured to in an old-fashioned schoolroom. And so we made the difficult decision, but important one, I think, to strictly stick to photographs. It was a decision our editors did not like. It was a much more difficult task to edit such a story, but we feel it really translates well onto the screen. The second decision we made was to be very careful, but to use the original photographs whenever possible, instead of using second or third or fourth generation copy prints. So with great painstaking care, we opened up some of these wonderfully perfect condition 19th century prints and put them against the wall and had a cameraman come in and film them. So you're really seeing on the screen, you won't see them tonight on a half-inch tape. We're going to show you portions of it, but it won't look as good as it will look when you see it on the screen. I really think that the immediacy is going to jump forth at you, and you're going to see detail like you haven't seen before. The music. We were big believers in this show of using Westchester talent, and if there are probably more than these. I just jotted down. Ossie Davis is a Westchester resident. E.G. Marshall, Glenn Close, who plays Mary Lincoln, Jill Clayburgh. All of them are from around here and who read voices in the show. But also Alan Menken. And as I talk about the music, Alan Menken, who is the composer of Aladdin that's out now, Beauty and the Beast, and The Little Mermaid, is a resident of Katona. We hadn't met him, but Philip and I were both fans of his because we both have young children who were big fans of his movie. And we approached him and proposed Lincoln to him, and he eagerly got aboard. He was a big Lincoln fan and wanted to be part of a documentary, which he had not done before. So in the show, you're going to hear two types of music. One is kind of what we loosely refer to as a feature film soundtrack, which is the Menken music, and the other is the period music of the day, the Civil War music that has become classic. We didn't fight battles for the most part in this program. This is not a show strictly about the Civil War, except where it reflected on Lincoln himself. So our sound effects job was much more difficult. We really had to bring alive quiet, private scenes rather than the big scenes that are, in fact, much easier to bring alive through sound effects. And finally, our actors. We were bowled over that virtually everyone we approached said yes. There are more than 30 big name stars in this show, and each time we approached them, the idea of working on a show about Abraham Lincoln triggered something, and they would say yes. We did a lot of the recording out of Mount Kisco. We conceived of something that I don't think has been done much, but since most of these actors were from California, we did them via telephone hookup, and Philip and I would sit on one end of the phone and direct the actors through the telephone. They would be recorded in an audio booth in California, and we would be able to talk back and forth and get it to the point where we were happy with it. Many of the actors brought their own view of the parts, had done research, had strong feelings about how it should be done. I'll just mention a couple. Franklin Jella, who was our choice as John Wilkes Booth, wanted to read it almost as if it had been written as a private diary reading, as if he was thinking aloud, and he evokes a very eerie, crazed individual. We were bowled over. He did not want us to stop and start him in between takes. He wanted to read it without being stopped, and we used every one of his takes without changing any of them. Ossie Davis, who plays Frederick Douglass, had written a children's book about Frederick Douglass, and very much felt very strongly about playing that part. We approached Glenn Close about reading the role of Mary Lincoln, but she was just opening on Broadway at the time, and initially said no through her press people. But Philip put together a biography of Mary Lincoln and some photographs, and we sent them over, and one weekend she found the packet again, and it was going through it, and she called back up herself after the weekend and said, I just find this woman so remarkable, I want to play this. Is the part still open? And she ended up playing the part. Jason Robards was far and away our first choice for Abraham Lincoln. He's from Illinois. He's probably played Lincoln more times than anyone else, and we couldn't think of anyone else who could do a better job. He's from Connecticut, and we did all the recording in Westport. And finally, James Earl Jones was our choice as a narrator. We felt it was an important thing to have a black American narrate the Lincoln story. And James Earl Jones himself said to us that he felt strongly that he wanted to send a message to black youth of today that Abraham Lincoln was the great hero of the black people of America. So he really put his heart and soul and worked very hard on this. He probably more than anyone on our acting team, he put most into it. All the writing was based on primary research, as I say, from my grandmother's collection. The chief architect of the television show was my brother Philip, who worked over those primary sources. He's going to be talking to you tonight about the show and about the book, and he's going to be introducing some clips and telling you what comes in between, in effect, what you're not seeing tonight. He's going to speak about why Lincoln is important to look at again in 1992. Bring him up.
The secret of Lincoln's continuing vogue, once wrote Harvard historian David Herbert Donald, is his essential ambiguity. He can be cited on all sides of all questions. If this is true, it may help explain why both President Bush and President-elect Bill Clinton each claims Lincoln as his chief model in public life. And it may help explain why Martin Luther King Jr. saw Lincoln as a major force for racial justice, while at precisely the same time, Malcolm X was describing Lincoln as a duplicitous fraud. Indeed, the biographical treatments of Lincoln have ranged from outright hagiography and hero worship to revisionist mudslinging and cynicism. With every generation, he seems to come into and out of fashion. In our book and in our film, we've tried to avoid either extreme. One of our chief goals, as my father has said tonight, was to present Lincoln the man, flaws and all. But finally, it is also true that we have insisted upon Lincoln's basic integrity and on his ongoing importance to the definition and very existence of American democracy. He spoke of it as an almost sacred calling. We were to become a nation where all should have an equal chance, he said, over and over again. Never forget, he said in 1859, that we have before us this whole matter of right or wrong, of slavery in this union. To Lincoln, the Declaration of Independence was America's beacon light. And the war itself was a test to see whether a nation dedicated to such an ideal could long endure. Calling America's democracy the last, best hope of earth, and the country itself as God's almost chosen people, Lincoln was finally able to take the leap he knew all along was most needed, a total and irrevocable abolishment of slavery. His second inaugural address to the nation was like a sermon on the subject, a profound rumination on the awful realities of slavery and war. Could it be that all the suffering of this terrible strife, he asked, were a part of the cost of eradicating slavery from the face of America? If so, then it was a cost required of both North and South, just as the sin of slavery belonged to the entire nation. So rather than an essential ambiguity, as Professor Donald has written, I would prefer to speak about an essential mystery to Lincoln. I would rather speak of a depth, a moral depth, that makes Lincoln continually elude our best efforts to capture him biographically. This quality, combined with an almost complete lack of fanaticism on his part, as well as a legendary kindliness and a courage, helps define, for me at least, Lincoln's enduring greatness. Let me speak a little bit about the process that led to the formation of this film and how it relates to our book. One of the important features of our book is an aspect of the book we call the eyewitnesses. We have sprinkled throughout the pages of this book over 100 shaded boxes in which you may find the actual words of people who knew Lincoln and who could say something important about what they had actually seen with their own eyes. We feel that it is a kind of backbone of the book. You return to this technique again and again, and they help bring alive the story. Well, these eyewitnesses are also central to the film. There are not hundreds of them, as in the book, but there are 72 characters that we winnowed down. Huge number for any kind of a movie. At the center of them all, of course, is Abraham Lincoln. And what you'll hear in our show are his actual words and no other words, chosen from his writings and also chosen from reliable first-hand accounts of his spoken utterances. But hundreds of other primary sources stand behind the film as well. Newspaper articles and printed speeches, letters and diaries, interviews, published reminiscences, early biographies written by the eyewitnesses themselves. For example, you take the 3-volume massive diary of the Navy Secretary under Lincoln, Gideon Welles, always caustic, sometimes emotional, comprehensive in detail. Or take the diary and letters of Lincoln's personal secretary, John Milton Hay, vivid, sparkling with good humor. Or the extraordinary first-hand interviews conducted by Lincoln's law partner, William Herndon, for example, with Lincoln's stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, in September 1865, just months after the assassination. Or with Mary Lincoln herself in 1874. It was my delight and joy and job to comb through literally hundreds of these kind of original sources, select the key characters, and then choose the words from each one of them that linked together would help drive the drama forward. The narrator, of course, represents our voice and gives us a chance to say some things about Lincoln and his world, but all of the characters you hear speak entirely in their own words. But what's different about this film, we feel, is not just the well-known important figures in it, the people we all study in class, Ulysses S. Grant or William Seward or General McClellan. These are great figures and they're there. But almost more wonderfully, there is the host of little people that are also part of this story. People that became, almost despite themselves, primary witnesses of Lincoln's story. I'll mention just a few. There, you may have heard of Mary Lincoln's seamstress in the White House, a former slave by the name of Elizabeth Keckley, who not only worked for the Lincolns for many years, but became, over the course of time, Mary's chief confidant and really her most devoted friend. She's played in our film by Oprah Winfrey, who does an amazing job with it. Or take the character of William Crook, William Henry Crook, a Washington, D.C. policeman who was hired just months before Lincoln's death and assigned to be one of 4 presidential bodyguards to tag Lincoln, follow him like a shadow wherever he would go. Lincoln hated this encumbrance, preferred to be out and about on his own, but became a close friend to William Crook, at least for a number of months. Or take John Buckingham, whose one claim to fame was that he was the doorkeeper at Ford's Theater on the night of the assassination, and that he actually saw Booth enter the building. It is the authentic accounts of these and 70 other persons who knew Lincoln in one way or another which give our narrative its bite. So, enough preliminaries. We'd like to show you 6 excerpts from the show now. We've chosen to show you the opening few minutes and the closing few minutes, and then we've taken a few spots from the middle. But you're not going to see some of the most obvious ones that you might have expected you'd see. You're not going to see, for example, the Gettysburg Address being delivered, or any of the key Civil War battles that are so famous. And we're not even going to show you the assassination itself. These are all there in the show, and they're very important parts of the show. But instead, we've given you a taste of some of the lesser well-known parts of the story, and we hope you enjoy them. So let's begin with the first opening clip.
I was born February 12th, 1809 in Hardin County, Kentucky, a mile or mile and a half from where Hodgensville is. I know no means of identifying the precise locality. It was on Nolan Creek. My earliest recollection, however, is of the Knob Creek place. I remember that old home very well. It lay in the valley, surrounded by high hills and deep gorges. We have a vague tradition that my great-grandfather went from Pennsylvania to Virginia, and that he was a Quaker. My grandfather's name was Abraham, same as my own. He was killed by the Indians. Further back than this, I have never heard anything. My father, being left an orphan at the age of 6 years, in poverty, became a wholly uneducated man, which I suppose is the reason why I know so little of our family history. It's very strange that I, a boy brought up in the woods and seeing, as it were, but little of the world, should be drifted into the very apex of this great event.
Chicago, 1860. It all started here, at the Republican National Convention, with the surprise nomination of a little-known politician named Abraham Lincoln. He was a 51-year-old prairie lawyer from Illinois, without any executive experience whatsoever. At issue was slavery. 4 million black people held in bondage in the South. Lincoln pledged to stop it from spreading. On slavery's extension, he said, we must hold firm as with a chain of steel.
Never till now has there been a time when the slaveholders have not dictated the choice of a president. The battle is over. The victory won. Hannibal Hamlin is elected vice president and Abraham Lincoln president of the United States.
All eyes were focused on Springfield, Illinois, to learn more about Lincoln the Unknown. Springfield and Abraham Lincoln had practically grown up together. A muddy frontier town of 2,000 and an insecure but ambitious young man from the backwoods. It had been easy to spot Lincoln as the rising young wonder 20 years earlier. The townspeople had watched him grow into one of the top attorneys in the West, the leader of his political party, an extraordinary user of words, and not the least, the tallest man around.
I am in height 6 feet 4 inches nearly, lean in flesh, weighing on an average 180 pounds. Dark complexion with coarse black hair and gray eyes. No other marks or brands recollected. My wife is as handsome as when she was a girl, and I, a poor nobody then, fell in love with her. I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughters. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7 years of age.
Lincoln rarely spoke of a 4th son, Eddie, who had died a decade earlier. His youngest boy was Thomas, who had a head so big Lincoln called him Tadpole, Tad for short. Willie, the middle child, always said one day he'd be a preacher. He was Lincoln's favorite. Lincoln's eldest son, Robert, was strangely aloof, never managing to become close to his famous father. Their mother was the well-educated, clothes-conscious Kentucky aristocrat, Mary Todd.
My mother died when I was very young. I was educated by Mademoiselle Montel, a French lady, and I came to Illinois in 1837. My husband placed great reliance on my knowledge of human nature, and I had an ambition to be Mrs. President.
His house was a 2-story frame building with an outhouse in back and a stable behind it. He kept his own horse, fed and milked his own cow, sawed his own wood. He was both ordinary and extraordinary. To some, a great man in the making. To others, he was woefully unprepared for high office and the mounting crisis that faced him. By February 1861, as Lincoln prepared to leave for Washington in the presidency, 6 states had already seceded, and Southern newspapers called for secession. War talk now spread across the nation.
Lynchburg, Virginia. I have heard several persons in this place say that if you ever did take the president's chair, that they would go to Washington City expressly to kill you. Don't you take it. Resign. If you don't, you will be murdered.
In preparation for his departure, Lincoln gave his little dog Fido to a neighbor. He found a new home for his horse, old Bob. He packed up his library, sold his furniture, and went around from house to house saying goodbye. Then at the Chancery House, where he spent his last day in Springfield, Lincoln roped up his own trunks and wrote on their labels, A. Lincoln, the White House, Washington, D.C.
I just want to ask one question. Could everybody hear loud? Is it loud enough? Yes. Fine. As death threats mount, Lincoln is smuggled into Washington by secret night train. Despite his earnest pleas for peace on Inauguration Day, within weeks, civil war suddenly erupts. The next 40 minutes of television show Lincoln's great efforts to protect Washington, raise an army, and become master of his government. They also begin to explore the life of the second most important character in this show, Lincoln's wife, Mary. Intensely devoted to her husband, Mary was on an almost opposite trajectory from him. While the war years became the furnace that forged Lincoln's increasing greatness, for Mary they were years of deepening gloom and progressive unraveling. The part you're about to see takes place early on in Lincoln's first term, before the death of their son Willie, which would be so devastating to Mary. But already a marked instability is present.
I consider myself fortunate if at 11 o'clock I find myself in my room and my tired and weary husband is there to receive me, to chat over the occurrences of the day.
Feeling useless and alone, Mary turned for relief to a whirlwind of spending on clothes and jewelry.
I must dress in costly materials. The people scrutinize every article that I wear. The very fact of having grown up in the West subjects me to searching observation. To keep up appearances, I must have money, more than Mr. Lincoln can spare for me.
Mary's New York shopping sprees became notorious as she squandered money at the splendid emporiums. There was also the one real task that etiquette would allow a president's wife, the refurbishing of the White House. In 8 short months, she had overspent an allotment meant to last 4 years.
I often laugh and tell Mr. Lincoln that I am determined my next husband shall be rich. Mr. Lincoln is too honest to make a penny outside of his salary. Consequently, I have no alternative but to run in debt. If he knew the extent, the knowledge would drive him wild.
Mary tried to hide the extravagances from the president until it was no longer possible.
I have called, Mr. President, on a matter about which I have no official concern. Mr. Carroll has presented a bill of some $7,000 over the appropriation for furnishing this house, and before I can pay it, it must have your approval.
It was all wrong to spend 1 cent at such a time. The house was furnished well enough, better than any one we ever lived in. It can never have my approval. I'll pay it out of my own pocket first. It would stink in the nostrils of the American people to have it said that the President of the United States had approved a bill overrunning an appropriation of $20,000 for flub-dubs for this damned old house, when the soldiers cannot have blankets.
The autumn months passed away, but there was no fighting, mainly reviews. The winter months came. General McClellan's Grand Army, being now thoroughly organized and disciplined, went not to fight, but into winter quarters. And the people, ever patient, waited for springtide.
We have had no war. We have not even been playing war. We should be sweeping treason out with fire and sword. McClellan has got to fight or run away.
Through a series of flashbacks, we return to Lincoln's past to find out who this man is. His impoverished childhood, his laborious self-education and decision to become a lawyer, his wedding and marriage, his entrance into politics. What you're going to see next is a flashback to the year 1858. After we face squarely the fact of Lincoln's early prejudice in favor of whites, we then show him as the great opponent of slavery he was. Lincoln's debates with Stephen A. Douglas on slavery in America literally captured the nation's attention.
The Lincoln-Douglas debates showed Lincoln as an uncompromising opponent of slavery. Drawing crowds of 10, 15, 20,000 and more, it was oratory, politics, and outdoor entertainment rolled into one. One New York reporter exclaimed, "The prairies are on fire."
I hold that the signers of the Declaration of Independence had no reference to niggers at all when they declared all men to be created equal. They did not mean the Negro, nor the savage Indians, nor the Fiji Islanders, nor any other barbarous race. They were speaking of white men.
Our fathers left slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. Judge Douglas and his friends wish it to become national and perpetual. He is blowing out the moral lights around us.
It does not become Mr. Lincoln or anybody else to tell people that they have no consciences. Judge not, lest ye shall be judged.
The Democratic Party has deliberately taken Negroes from the class of men and put them in the class of brutes. I want every man to have a chance, and I believe a black man is entitled to it.
I am told a rich black Negro is now traveling this part of the state, making speeches for his friend Lincoln as the champion of the black men. If you think that the Negro ought to be on a social equality with your wives, daughters, ride in a carriage with your wife whilst you drive the team, then support Mr. Lincoln.
This issue will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. There is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights in the Declaration of Independence, in the right to eat the bread which his own hand earns. He is my equal, and the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every other man.
The debates and the national stature they afforded him would help catapult Lincoln into the presidency and give him the opportunity to do what no other president had ever dared consider: legislate slavery off the face of America.
On January 1st, 1863, the formal and solemn announcement was made that thereafter the government would be found on the side of emancipation. This proclamation changed everything.
The Emancipation Proclamation had been duly prepared for the President's signature.
As it lay unrolled before him, Mr. Lincoln took this pen, dipped it in ink, held it a moment, and then dropped the pen.
I've been shaking hands since 9 o'clock this morning, and my right arm is almost paralyzed. If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. If my hand trembles when I sign the proclamation, all who examine the document hereafter will say, he hesitated.
He then turned to the table, took up the pen again, and slowly, firmly wrote that Abraham Lincoln with which the whole world is now familiar. He looked up, smiled, and said, "That will do."
We are a good deal like whalers who have been long on a chase. At last, we have got our harpoon fairly into the monster.
The film now turns to chronicle the war years themselves. From the bloodiest day in American history at Antietam to the Union debacles at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville that so tried Lincoln's courage. And there are other crises as well. In late 1862, following an Indian uprising in Minnesota, white vigilante squads cried out for the execution of all Indians. With 303 Sioux sentenced to die, Lincoln intervenes personally. Refusing to fan racial flames, he permits 38 to be executed. The Union victory at Gettysburg in July 1863 became the turning point of the war. And that same autumn, Lincoln is invited to deliver a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of a new national cemetery at Gettysburg. In a never-equaled, 2-minute-long address to the nation, Lincoln unveils his vision for America's future. By the time of the next piece, we will show you we are already late in Lincoln's presidency. He has finally found in Ulysses S. Grant a general who knows how to fight. He has survived the lowest ebb of his popularity, and then, despite all predictions, been resoundingly elected to a second term of office. In the war's final year, we pause to focus upon Lincoln the man.
The president rose early, as his sleep was light and capricious. His breakfast was an egg and a cup of coffee.
He ate mechanically. I have seen him sit down at the table, and never, unless recalled to his senses, would he think of food. He was a peculiar man.
His size 14 feet gave him trouble.
I shall never get these boots on, till I wear them a day or two and stretch them a little.
Sometimes Lincoln decided against wearing boots and throughout the morning kept his slippers on. They made flip-flop sounds on the White House floors.
I like to give my feet a chance to breathe.
A servant tended his hair and beard, tying a napkin around the president's neck and shaking the clippings out of the White House window. He called his hair his bristles, and once, having been handed a delicate comb, asked, "Haven't you anything you comb your horse's mane with?"
I remember very well one incident. I was sent for by the president, who was in his own room. To my great surprise, I saw that he was struggling with a needle and thread. He was sewing a button on his trousers. "All right," he said, looking at me with a twinkle in his eye. "Just wait until I repair damages."
As time wore on, and the war held its terrible course, Lincoln's demeanor and disposition changed, so gradually that it would be impossible to say when the change began. The boisterous laughter became less frequent year by year. He aged with great rapidity.
I'm very unwell. My feet and hands always cold. I suppose I ought to be in bed. Sometimes I think I am the tiredest man on earth.
Lincoln had lost over 20 pounds during his presidency. 4 years earlier, his face was that of a dynamic, eager leader with unbounded energies. Now it had become the face of a tired and tortured, yet kindly and spiritual old man. He had just passed his 56th birthday.
We jump ahead now to the climax of our story. Lincoln has delivered an address, the second inaugural, which will stand beside the speech at Gettysburg as his greatest utterance. He has traveled to the front lines of battle for the closing days of the war, showing great empathy for the vanquished. Haunted now by dreams that predict his own death, there is also new joy as the war finally comes to an end. The following scene takes place on Lincoln's last day alive. His cabinet is about to meet.
At the meeting of the cabinet today, the president remarked that last night he had the dream again. It was always the same. It related to water. He seemed to be in some singular, indescribable vessel, moving with great rapidity.
I am in a boat, and I drift. And I drift. Gentlemen, something extraordinary is going to happen, and very soon.
In the afternoon, Lincoln invited Mary to join him for a carriage ride.
I asked him if anyone should accompany us. He immediately replied, "No, I prefer to ride by ourselves today." During the drive, he was so gay that I said to him laughingly, "My dear husband, you almost startled me by your great cheerfulness." He replied, "And well I may feel so, Mary. I consider this day the war has come to a close." Then he added, "We must both be more cheerful in the future. Between the war and the loss of our darling Willie, we have both been very miserable."
He spoke of his old Springfield home, recollections of his early days, the law office, courtroom, the green bag for his briefs and law papers. His adventures when riding the circuit came thronging back to him. The tension under which he had for so long been kept was removed, and he was like a boy out of school.
At the National Hotel, John Wilkes Booth's day began at the stroke of midnight, as he lay wide awake in room 228. The time had come for him to do something decisive.
April 14th, dearest mother. I know you expect a letter from me, and am sure you will hardly forgive me. But indeed, I have nothing to write about. Everything is dull.
Booth learned in the daily paper of the president's plan to attend Ford's Theater that evening. 4 of Booth's fellow conspirators now agreed to participate in a new plan. Lewis Payne, the Florida strongman, was instructed to murder Secretary of State William Seward in his bed. Beady-eyed alcoholic George Atzerodt was ordered to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson. Davy Harold, the pretty boy with the mind of an 11-year-old, was to assist in their escape from Washington. Booth himself would kill the president.
I almost begged him to remain in the executive mansion that night and not to go to the theater. But he would not disappoint Mrs. Lincoln and others who were to be present. Then I urged that he allow me to stay on duty and accompany him, but he would not hear of this either.
No, Crook, you have had a long, hard day's work already and must go home to sleep and rest. I cannot afford to have you get tired out and exhausted.
It was then that he neglected for the first and only time to say good night to me. Instead, he turned with his kind, grave face and said, "Goodbye, Crook."
The comedy, Our American Cousin, had already begun to play to a packed house when the Lincoln party arrived from the cold and foggy night. Attending with the Lincolns were Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. As the group entered the theater, the play halted, the orchestra struck up with Hail to the Chief, and the entire audience rose and cheered. The presidential party then entered the special state box, and the play resumed. Just a little before 10 p.m., with the play still early in Act 3, Mary put her arms around Lincoln.
What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?
She won't think anything about it.
Those were the last words that Lincoln ever spoke.
A little after 10 o'clock, Booth walked into my bar and called for some whiskey. I gave him the whiskey. I put the bottle on the counter, and then he called for some water. Put the money on the counter and went right off.
Booth had been in and out of the theater throughout the evening.
He came to me and asked what time it was. I told him to step into the lobby and he could see. He stepped out and walked in again and then went up the stairway to the dress circle.
Unbeknownst to Lincoln, his personal messenger, Charles Forbes, had vacated the anteroom of the presidential box and taken a seat in the audience where he could see the play. A guard assigned to stand outside the Lincoln box had also abandoned his post, leaving the way clear for Booth to move up toward the door.
After John Wilkes Booth's bullet and the long, sad night of watching as Lincoln dies, our film turns to the aftermath of the Lincoln story. It becomes the most extraordinary funeral the world has ever seen, ensuring that his memory will never die. Now Lincoln is brought home to Springfield, Illinois, to be tenderly laid to rest.
In the procession to the cemetery, Lincoln's horse, Old Bob, would follow directly behind the hearse. Lincoln's cousin, John Hanks, was there, his only relative from back home who turned up. Sarah Bush Lincoln was just too weak to make the trip from her Goose Nest prairie cabin.
I did not want Abe to run for president, did not want him elected, was afraid somehow or other. Felt it in my heart that something would happen to him. Oh, my boy Abe, they killed him. I know they would. I know they would. I've been waiting for it.
No march in the West had ever been so large. It led to a limestone receiving tomb carved into a steep hillside, on top of which a majestic monument would rise. All the singing and music gave the day a semblance of festivity, but nothing could hide the overpowering feeling of loss.
It is hard to realize that he is gone, that we shall no more see his commanding form, hear his kind voice, or touch his honest hand with its well-remembered earnestness. It is hard to take in the dreadful thought that the head of the nation has perished by the hand of an assassin. But so it is.
He was home. The man who embodied the spirit of what Americans could be at their noblest, their best. Lincoln's large coffin and Willie's small one were gently placed side by side inside the heavy iron gates and strewn with spring flowers in the gardens of their Springfield neighbors. Robert Lincoln had attended the first and now the final of his father's funerals. Mary remained in Washington, confining herself to her bedroom, unable to attend any of them.
No such sorrow was ever visited upon a people or family as when we were bereaved of my darling husband. Every day causes me to feel more crushed and broken-hearted. Time does not soften my grief, nor can I ever be reconciled to my loss until the grave closes and I am reunited with him.
We will be remembered in spite of ourselves. 25 years ago, I was a hired laborer, mauling rails, at work on a flatboat, just like any poor man's son. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.
That's the end of our presentation. If I know we're running a little late. If any of you have questions, we'd be happy to try to answer them. And if not, we'll see you outside. Are there any questions? It's on December 26th from 8 to 10 and 27th from 7 to 9 on ABC, Channel 7.